Summer 1943. Sicily baked under a sun as merciless as any weapon. For Italian soldiers who had survived years of ration cards, thin soups, and crusts of black bread, the war had already drained the romance from Mussolini's grand promises. Many were young men from mountain villages or coastal towns, conscripts who had grown up on olives, tomatoes, and pasta stretched with water. Meat was a rarity, sugar a fading memory. By the time Allied forces surged across the Mediterranean and into their homeland, hunger was a familiar companion. When capture came, it brought fear. Fascist propaganda had prepared them for brutality. America, they had been told, was a land of chaos and cruelty, where prisoners would be starved or worked to death. Yet the first shock of captivity was not hunger, but taste. At a processing camp in North Africa, a young Italian private, barely 20 years old, was handed a bottle of dark, fizzing liquid. He tilted it uncertainly, hearing the hiss as the cap came off. One sip, and his eyes widened. The sweetness was overwhelming, a rush of sugar and bubbles that seemed almost impossible. He had never tasted anything like it. Coca-Cola. For the price of 5 American cents, the guards told him, children back in the States drank it every day with their pocket money. Beside him, another prisoner stared at the food ladled onto his plate. It wasn't pasta, nor the rustic sausages of home, but something stranger, a sausage tucked into a soft white bun, topped with mustard. A hot dog. To the Italian palate, accustomed to careful preparation and family recipes passed down through generations, this was bewildering. The meat was uniform, the bread unnaturally soft, the mustard sharp, yet it was filling, plentiful, and most shocking of all casual. Americans ate these by the dozen, at baseball games, on street corners, even in the prison camps. What for Italians was unthinkable luxury meat every day was in America a snack. The cultural collision was immediate. Coca-Cola and hot dogs were not just foods, they were symbols. To the Italians they represented abundance without ceremony, nourishment without ration cards, pleasure without guilt. Back home, mothers stretched flour with chestnut meal to make bread. Sugar, when it appeared, was measured out by the gram. A single sausage might be shared among 3 children, yet here, in the hands of their captors, were bottles of sweetness and piles of sausages that could be consumed without thought. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, smuggled through the censors, "The Americans eat for joy, not for survival. Their food is like their spirit, overflowing, careless, and endless. To drink Coca-Cola and eat a hot dog is to know that our world has already lost." The first encounters with these foods were not simply meals, they were lessons, quietly but unmistakably delivered. Italian prisoners realized, even before setting foot on American soil, that the nation which could serve hot dogs to enemies and give away Coca-Cola to children was a nation whose strength ran deeper than tanks or planes. It was a strength baked into every bun, bottled in every soda, and offered casually even to those who had been sent to fight against it. The collapse came swiftly in 1943. After years of war that had bled Italy dry, the Allied landings in Sicily struck like a hammer against a hollow shell. Italian divisions, undersupplied and demoralized, surrendered in their tens of thousands. To many young conscripts, there was relief in capture, but beneath it lay dread. Fascist broadcasts had painted a grim picture of captivity, starvation, forced labor, humiliation at the hands of the Americans. Mothers had whispered the same warnings, better to die than fall into enemy hands. Reality proved very different. In the dust of Sicilian fields and the barren camps of North Africa, Italian POWs received their first American rations. The khaki boxes stamped U.S. Army K ration looked unremarkable, but inside was a feast beyond imagination. Processed cheese, biscuits, a small tin of meat, powdered coffee, chocolate, even cigarettes. To the Americans who grumbled about these rations, they were monotonous and uninspired. To Italian prisoners who had lived on watery soup and crusts of bread, they were a revelation. One lieutenant later recalled the moment his men unwrapped their first cans of pork luncheon meat. They laughed nervously, unsure if it was meant for them. "We had been warned the Americans would starve us," he said years later, "and instead they fed us like kings. Even the cigarettes were real, not dried leaves rolled in paper, but proper tobacco. This shock deepened on the journey across the Atlantic. Packed aboard Liberty ships, the vast steel workhorses of the American war effort, Italian prisoners expected foul holds, starvation, and brutality. Instead, they were surprised to find organized bunks, regular meals, and an odd sense of order. Liberty ships were being launched at such a pace, one every few days, that they symbolized American industrial muscle as much as any tank or airplane. And on these vessels, POW rations often matched those of the crew. Breakfast might bring eggs and bread. Dinner could mean stew or meat with vegetables. But what stood out most was the regular appearance of foods that had vanished from Italy years earlier. Fresh bread, soft and white instead of black and heavy. Meat served not as a rare luxury, but as routine. Even hot dogs, simple sausages on soft rolls, appeared on some voyages, handed out as quick meals to men too seasick or weary to linger in line. Coffee with sugar and milk, served daily, astonished the prisoners. Many had not tasted sugar in years, and when the occasional tub of ice cream emerged from the ship's refrigeration system, the Italians stared in disbelief. Frozen dessert, in the middle of the ocean, given to men captured as enemies, such generosity defied everything they had been taught. The voyage across the Atlantic became its own classroom. Every meal, every cigarette, every unexpected indulgence whispered the same message. America had resources to spare. It was not chaos, nor cruelty, but abundance and order that defined their captors. The journey that began with fear turned into an education, one sausage, one bottle of Coke, one hot meal at a time. For the Italians, captivity had begun not with hunger, but with plenty. And as their ships cut westward across the Atlantic, many prisoners began to wonder, if this was how America treated its enemies, what power must it show to its friends? The voyage ended not in darkness, but in light. When Italian prisoners stepped off Liberty ships in the summer of 1943, they found themselves in ports unlike anything they had ever seen: Norfolk, Newport News, New York. These cities radiated scale and order on a level that Mussolini's empire had only boasted of in speeches. For men who had marched through Sicily's crumbling towns or been stationed in North Africa's barren outposts, the American docks were bewildering. Warehouses stretched farther than the eye could follow. Endless rail lines rattled with boxcars piled high with food and supplies. Forklifts, a novelty to most Europeans, darted between stacks of crates. It wasn't chaos. It was orchestration, a daily rhythm of abundance that dwarfed anything Italy or even Germany had managed. And then there was the food. As the men were processed, guarded by soldiers who seemed strangely relaxed, their eyes caught the sights and smells of America. Dock workers on break drank from glass bottles filled with the same dark fizz they had first tasted in Africa, Coca-Cola. But here, it wasn't an occasional treat. It was everywhere: soda fountains, vending machines, shops along the port. To Americans, it was as common as water. To Italians, it was a mystery. How could a nation produce so much of a luxury that even children could buy it for a nickel? But if Coca-Cola was bewildering, the hot dog was even more so. At small diners near the rail yards, POWs being transported inland glimpsed the unmistakable sight of Americans standing at counters, biting into sausages tucked into pillowy buns, topped with bright yellow mustard or relish. It wasn't a feast prepared for a holiday, nor a ration carefully divided. It was a snack, casual and cheap. In Italy, sausage was rare and precious, reserved for festivals or special meals. Here, it was mass-produced, served with one hand while reading a newspaper with the other. The prisoners couldn't decide if it was vulgar or miraculous. Soon, they experienced it for themselves. Passenger coaches carried them inland, not the cattle cars they knew from Europe, but standard trains with upholstered seats. Some trains included dining cars, where Italian POWs sat stunned before plates of fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and yes, even hot dogs, served with casual efficiency. One prisoner later recalled, "It was the first time I saw a meal that seemed made for speed, for motion. The hot dog was not cuisine, it was fuel. But what fuel? Meat every day, bread as soft as clouds. It told us everything about American life. The realization settled slowly. These foods weren't symbols of special privilege. They weren't propaganda. They were ordinary. What Italians had come to think of as impossible luxuries were simply part of daily life in the United States. The docks, the diners, the train stations all whispered the same unsettling truth. America had built a world where the impossible was routine, and as the trains carried them deeper into the continent, the prisoners wondered what further surprises awaited behind the barbed wire of the camps. By the time the trains stopped and the barbed wire fences came into view, the Italian POWs braced themselves. Surely now the generosity would end. Captivity, they assumed, must still mean deprivation. But the camps they entered in places like Camp Atterbury, Indiana, or Camp Hereford, Texas, bore little resemblance to the dungeons of their imagination. The barracks were heated in winter, with electric lights and hot water. The latrines had flush toilets. Mess halls ran on regular schedules, serving 3 full meals a day. These details alone exceeded the living standards many Italians had known as free civilians back home, where wartime shortages had left families huddling in cold kitchens and scavenging firewood. And then came the canteens, the post-exchanges, or PX stores, where the true astonishment began. For a few cents of camp wages, Italian prisoners could buy candy bars, cigarettes, fresh fruit, and above all, bottles of Coca-Cola. They quickly learned the economics. A day's labor in camp fields or workshops earned 80 cents to $1. A Coke cost a nickel. A candy bar, the same. That meant 16 bottles of Coke for a day's work, luxury stacked upon luxury. For men who had not seen sugar in years, it was as if America had placed abundance within arm's reach, limited only by appetite. But nothing symbolized that abundance more vividly than the hot dog. In PX stores equipped with small kitchens, or during weekend celebrations, hot dogs were served as casually as bread. A sausage in a bun with mustard for 10 cents. To Americans, it was a quick snack, hardly worth mentioning. To Italians, it was nothing short of surreal. Sausage, once a precious centerpiece of feast days, was here, ground, packed, and served daily without fanfare. A Tuscan farmer who once waited all year for a pork festival could now buy a hot dog any afternoon from his captors. The cultural shock ran deep. Food in Italy had always been an art form, bound by family tradition, rooted in scarcity and careful preparation. But in American camps, food became something else. Standardized, abundant, democratic, everyone ate the same, guards and prisoners alike, the same Coke, the same hot dogs, the same candy bars. It was a system where quality didn't depend on privilege, but on production. One Italian POW later admitted in a memoir, "I did not understand America until I saw a soldier throw half a hot dog in the trash. To us, sausage was sacred. To them, it was casual. That was their power." Day by day, the message sank in. This was not propaganda on a loudspeaker, nor slogans painted on walls. It was reality lived through meals. The POWs discovered that in America, even in captivity, they could eat better than their families in freedom. And in that contrast, the first cracks appeared in the old certainties drilled into them under fascism. Behind the barbed wire, Coca-Cola bottles clinked and hot dogs sizzled, and with each taste, Italian prisoners realized they were living inside a world their leaders had promised could not exist. The rhythm of camp life was steady roll call, work details, meals. But it was during the holidays that Italian POWs most keenly felt the vast gulf between their world and America's. For men who had grown up celebrating feast days on thin slices of bread and diluted wine, the American calendar seemed designed to overwhelm. Thanksgiving 1943 was the first revelation. By November, thousands of Italians were scattered across camps in the Midwest and South, expecting another day of rations. Instead, the mess halls erupted in abundance. Roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes dripping with gravy, sweet potatoes glazed with syrup, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, milk, and coffee. To American guards, this was tradition, nothing unusual. To the prisoners, it bordered on the miraculous. One officer later wrote that he could scarcely believe the Americans would extend the same holiday meal to their enemies as to their own soldiers. But the true cultural clash came in the summer months. For Independence Day celebrations, many camps organized baseball games, music, and outdoor feasts. There, the Italian POWs met a food that became, in their minds, the symbol of America's casual excess: the hot dog. Grilled by the hundreds, slathered in mustard, piled high on paper plates alongside potato salad and watermelon, hot dogs were handed out with Coca-Cola bottles as if they were nothing at all. Children of camp staff grabbed 2 or 3 without hesitation, while prisoners, many of whom had not tasted sausage since before the war, marveled that this meat was treated like a snack, not a treasure. In Italy, sausage was the centerpiece of Christmas or Easter, saved for feasts and shared with reverence. Here, in America, sausages had been reborn as hot dogs, mass-produced, standardized, and democratically distributed. To an Italian farmer or fisherman turned soldier, this was not just food, it was a revelation of industrial power. Christmas 1943 brought another kind of shock: kindness from civilians. Packages arrived from church groups and local families, homemade cookies, candy, cigarettes, even books and games. In Oklahoma, townspeople baked sweets for the POWs at Camp Tonkawa. In Texas, church groups visited Camp Hearn with Christmas treats. These acts of generosity confused the prisoners even more than the abundance of food. Americans who had brothers and sons fighting in Italy still brought gifts to men in enemy uniforms. One Italian POW later recalled, "We thought they would hate us. Instead, they gave us cakes and hot dogs at their festivals." It was harder to understand than the war itself. The celebrations were more than meals. They were demonstrations of a society so confident in its strength that it could share with enemies. Every Coke bottle opened, every hot dog handed over at a 4th of July picnic carried a quiet but undeniable message. America's power was not only in its armies, but in its ability to make plenty feel ordinary. By the end of 1943, the Italian prisoners had learned something their fascist leaders had never admitted. Abundance was not a dream, but a system, and they were living inside it. By 1944, the war had pulled millions of American men overseas, leaving fields unharvested and factories short of hands. Italian prisoners, once considered enemies, became essential laborers. Under guard, they were sent beyond the barbed wire to work in agriculture, food processing, and industry. What they witnessed there transformed astonishment into something deeper: understanding. In the orchards of Michigan, POWs picked cherries by the ton. Truckloads rolled away toward factories where the fruit would be canned or turned into maraschino garnishes for ice cream sundaes. To men who had grown up watching their mothers preserve fruit jar by jar, the sheer industrial volume was staggering. Food here was not a treasure hoarded for survival, it was decoration, produced in quantities so vast it could be used to top a dessert. At canneries in the Midwest, Italian prisoners watched with disbelief as machines rejected perfect fruit for blemishes too minor for human eyes. Those discarded apples and peaches, which would have been eagerly eaten in starving Naples, were swept aside for animal feed. Waste on such a scale seemed like blasphemy, yet it also revealed a new truth. America was so abundant that imperfection could be thrown away without regret, but nothing struck the Italians more than the meatpacking plants. Escorted into sprawling facilities in Illinois and Iowa, they saw production lines of pork and beef that dwarfed anything in Europe. Sausages poured from machines by the thousands, linked and packaged with mechanical precision. For the first time, the POWs understood the secret of the hot dog. It was not a rare sausage crafted by a butcher's hands, but a product of industrial efficiency. What in Italy had been the centerpiece of feast days was, in America, an everyday staple, churned out by the ton. POWs whispered to each other in awe. This is how they can eat sausage every day. This is how hot dogs are born. The setting. Meanwhile, in sugar beet fields across Nebraska and Colorado, prisoners bent their backs beside machines that harvested with ruthless speed. They learned that America produced millions of tons of sugar each year from cane in the South, beets in the plains explaining the heaping bowls of sugar in mess halls and the endless supply of Coca-Cola bottles. Back home, sugar was rationed in grams. Here, it was measured in tons. Perhaps most astonishing were the schools. On work details near small towns, prisoners glimpsed children eating hot lunches in cafeterias. Milk, meat, vegetables, even desserts. In some schools, ice cream was offered as an extra purchase. To see American children drinking milk daily while Italian children scrounged for bread crusts was a revelation that shook the POWs more deeply than any battlefield defeat. One prisoner later confessed, "We learned more about America in the fields and factories than in the classrooms of re-education. Hot dogs, Coca-Cola, sugar, milk, they were the lessons. We saw that abundance was not a show, it was a system. Through labor, the Italians discovered the engine that powered the abundance they had tasted in camps. America's factories, farms, and fields turned luxuries into routine, making hot dogs and Coca-Cola not propaganda, but daily reality." By the end of 1944, the war's tides were unmistakably turning. The Allies were advancing, and the Italian POWs, who had spent months or even years in the United States, were now preparing to return to a country on the brink of collapse. But when they boarded the ships that would take them back to Italy, they were not the same men who had arrived on American shores. The transformation was evident the moment they stepped back onto their native soil. Many had gained weight in captivity, their faces fuller, their steps steadier. They carried the physical evidence of an abundance they had never known. But it wasn't just their bodies that had changed, there was a subtle shift in their minds, a recalibration of their very understanding of what was possible. Back home, their families were skeletal, having lived for years on a diet of rationed bread, vegetables, and the occasional bit of meat. The contrast was staggering. A former POW, returning to a village where children were thin and gaunt, remembered the confusion in his mother's eyes when he offered to buy her a meal. "You can't buy food like that anymore," she said, but he could. He had seen it in America. He had tasted it. Everyday sausage, fresh bread, hot dogs on the go, Coca-Cola with every meal. These weren't luxuries in America. They were just food. In the months following their return, the former POWs became reluctant spokesmen for American abundance, telling their families about the daily miracles they had witnessed. They spoke of hot dogs, of Coca-Cola served in every camp, of fresh fruit piled high in camp exchanges, of sugar bowls filled to the brim in mess halls. "I ate better in captivity than I did as a free man," one former soldier admitted. His words were met with silence. How could it be possible? The psychological shock continued as the returnees shared stories of the Americans' generosity. They spoke of the kindness shown to them by civilians, church groups sending cookies, families offering homemade treats, townspeople baking pies and delivering them to prison camps. This too was impossible in Italy, where such largesse had vanished under the weight of war. But here, in America, civilians had sent food to their enemies. They gave us hot dogs at their celebrations, gifts at Christmas, as if we were their guests. This shift in perspective ran deeper than just food. The former prisoners began to understand that the key to America's strength wasn't just its ability to produce, but its ability to share. For the first time, they realized that the wealth of a nation could be measured not only in factories and resources, but in the collective trust to distribute it to all, whether friend or foe. Their return to Italy marked the beginning of a quiet but profound change in the post-war mindset. Some former prisoners became early advocates for the American Marshall Plan, eager to rebuild their war-torn homeland with the lessons they had learned in captivity. They had seen firsthand how abundance could be shared, how industrial capacity could fuel prosperity, and how everyday luxuries, things like Coca-Cola and hot dogs, could be made available to everyone. Years later, when West Germany began its economic miracle in the 1950s, many of the Italian prisoners who had witnessed America's industrial might in the camps applied those lessons. They understood that prosperity didn't come through conquest, but through production and distribution. They had tasted the fruits of a system that worked, a system built on abundance, and they carried that belief with them into the rebuilding of Italy and Europe. For the Italian POWs, the greatest lesson wasn't in the harshness of war, but in the strength of a society that could feed even its enemies. The transformation was complete. The men who had once believed in Italy's superiority returned as witnesses to a new world order, one where abundance, not deprivation, could transform lives.